Welcome to our video and thank you for being here. Today we are going to discuss anti-oppressive practice as a framework for nonprofit refugee agencies to build into their service provision. We are going to begin with an introduction to AOP, an overview of how this can address isms and oppression, particularly within the context of agencies, and we are going to conclude with an exploration of an anti-oppressive toolkit we created to provide the basis for introducing AOP within this context.
Hi everybody, I just want to say a quick thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to our presentation. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is what is anti-oppressive practice. So when looking at anti-oppressive practice, it's important to understand kind of the basis of it, and that is that AOP essentially equals the fact that it opposes oppression through our work. So that's essentially the core of what we do when we apply AOP. So AOP brings together a number of social justice theories and approaches that oppose oppression, and people must therefore understand that these theories and approaches in order to successfully implement AOP. So that's a really core necessity for AOP, really understanding those theories in order to implement them in our practice more effectively. Anti-oppression work revolves around being able to recognize oppression and when it is happening, and be able to come up with ways in which we can work against it to promote equity for everybody. Without this, there is always the potential for groups to be stripped of their power, marginalized, and denied the same rights as others just because of the status that they possess. So when looking at anti-oppressive practice, it's important to understand what exactly oppression is. So when we look at the definition, or sort of like an understanding of oppression, we see that what determines oppression is when a person is blocked from opportunities to self-development, is excluded from full participation in society, does not have certain rights that the dominant group takes for granted, or is assigned a second-class citizenship, not because of individual talent, merit, or failure, but because of his or her membership in a particular group or category of people. Moreover, oppression is the way in which people with privilege use their power to hold down an already marginalized group of people in order to maintain their status. So a little bit of a reiteration of what I said earlier. Again, oppression, at the core of it is people using the privilege that they already have. Maybe it's unrecognized privilege or it is recognized, but that's all in an effort to hold back other groups so that they maintain their status overall. Moving on, anti-oppression deals with systems, not just the individual, and I thought that was something that was really important to make note of, because anti-oppression really tackles the root of the problem. And when we're working with just individuals, it's very possible to kind of solve their presenting problem, without delving into policy and things that have to do with the system itself. But that's only a quick fix, right? And so the aim of AOP is to get to the solution through assessing the system and how we can work from there to get to a better place at the core of the problem. So the next point is that the most important part about working from an anti-oppressive framework is acknowledging one's own privilege and power that they hold in the world and in relation to the people that they are surrounded by. Now, I think this is something that's really important for social workers and service providers to understand when they're working with, other marginalized groups, or when they're clearly in the position of power when working with other people, because this can help them navigate the way that they are interacting with others and their clients and such in a way that is respectful, self-aware, culturally sensitive, and if we're not taking into account our position of power, and we're not being reflective about that and how that can impact the people around us, and that can have a negative effect on the way in which we do our practice, which can lead to a more negative outcome. So finally, I'm going to talk about some questions that are important to ask when doing AOP. So the first one is, in all interactions and situations, have I thought about power, privilege, and social location, and how it impacts my actions? Have I questioned and challenged dominant ways of thinking to transform power towards equity? Equity means to treat people differently in order to create equal outcomes. Have I ensured the actions I have taken are equitable, collaborative, and power sharing? And how can I measure this? And lastly, if yes, how can I promote these AO actions at an institutional or systemic level? If not, what do I need to do differently? Through the lens of social work, I would say that these questions are super reflective, and they give workers the opportunity to really take a step back and understand the power that they hold and how this affects how they navigate themselves in the real world.
So now that we discussed what AOP is, we're going to get into why AOP is important. So previously, we recapped oppression, and we basically said that it's a highly unjust act done to individuals simply due to factors of their identity. So this can include race, gender, sexuality, etc. So AOP allows individuals to have the same opportunities regardless of factors of their identity. So, for example, one gender is treated the exact same way as another. AOP also allows us to examine when oppression is at play, and in contrast, when it's simply an unfair act, because distinguishing between the two is very, very important. AOP also focuses on the root causes of issues rather than the issues themselves. And AOP can be done through almost any form of service. So, for example, it can be done at child welfare agencies or counseling agencies, and can also be done at different levels. So, for example, the frontline social worker, all the way up to the head of a social work organization. So because of this, we're able to resolve oppression at various levels, including systems, cultures, and individual levels. It can also be applied to service users and fellow workers as well. So this helps to ensure that both the service user are taken care of, and also the workplace environment is an equitable and safe space to work.
Next, we're going to take a look at how AOP can be used to address isms and oppression. To begin, AOP is able to challenge whiteness in the structures that maintain it, which is a central factor in creating and reinforcing oppression, as well as making invisible the ways in which it operates. AOP intends to change the way that folks think, talk, and do everyday and non-everyday processes in a way that deconstructs whiteness. AOP involves resisting white innocence and acknowledging and calling out oppression, while blaming the oppressors and not the oppressed for their troubles. It also involves breaking down white, Western, and Eurocentric values, perspectives, and understandings as the only understandings, and involves an incorporation and valuing of different perspectives and approaches to practice. Within a refugee agency, this involves operating in a culturally competent framework and placing policy, procedures, and interactions outside of the context of whiteness and dominant Western Eurocentric norms. This also necessitates service providers to reflect upon themselves to recognize the blind spots that they may have in regards to recognizing oppression and understanding the implications of their visible or invisible identities on their practice. It is also necessary, within the context of refugee agencies and other forms of practice in life, to resist surveilling and disciplining those labeled as the other in a manner that often aligns with white, Western, and Eurocentric values. Enabling service users to construct their own thoughts, needs, and goals, and supporting them through that, rather than judging them or holding those up to a white standard, is essential, as well as constructing a non-white framework and language into the very work that is done. Now, likely, your next thought is, how can I go about challenging and deconstructing whiteness and bringing AOP values into my work? And the answer to that is that it starts with critical reflection on yourself, practice, and society. And this analysis must be continual and ongoing as a lifelong process for it to have a meaningful impact on your work. Analysis of the self is necessary in understanding the impacts of your social location, identity, and experiences on your practice, as the external power dynamics within society are inseparable from your work. Analysis at a socio-political level as well is necessary to understand how it shapes and impacts practice and the context in which service users live. This process is not simple, and there is no one-fits-all solution. However, we will give you a place to start. The following questions are suggested to bring about the beginnings of a deeper level of analysis on your interaction with service users and within your agency. First off, what is your identity? What areas of privilege, power, and oppression do you occupy? How do those interact with each other and impact your worldview? And finally, what are the implications of this on your work? What is your role in the community? Are you an insider, an outsider, or are you an expert? What is your service user's identity? What don't you know about their identity and why? How do you come to define their identity in the way that you do? What are the implications of this on your work? And finally, why do you think the way you think about this? You must also be thinking about your thought process, uncovering blind spots, and recognizing influences on the way that you think. It is important as well to continuously revisit reflections for why you are in social work or working within this agency, and how this is impacting the role that you play there. However, reflections cannot simply stay reflections. You must turn these into action for it to meaningfully benefit service users and deconstruct oppression. While this will be explored in greater detail in our toolkit at the end of this presentation, we will outline some initial steps that can be taken into consideration when doing anti-oppressive work on a more micro level of practice at first. For one, you must combine the knowledge you have about AOP with your service users' knowledge, perspectives, goals, and skills. Do not frame yourself as the expert of their situation, experiences, or life. They are the expert, and you are a tool for them to be supported through their time in interacting with your agency. This involves building an alliance with your service users that focuses on allyship. Listen to them and what they have to say, learn from them, and use the privilege and power you hold as a service provider to support them. Push back against oppression you see others doing in practice. Are your coworkers using oppressive language? Are they blaming service users for their troubles that are rooted in oppression? Are they imparting their values on service users? Call them in or call them out on this as appropriate and educate them on the importance of anti-oppression. Finally, it is important to use inclusive language. Do not make assumptions about service users. Use the language service users do about themselves and their experiences, and do not use language that is loaded and reinforces oppression. Start off by using the term partner instead of husband or wife. Seek out pronouns when users are comfortable, rather than assuming. Do not ask leading questions with what you think is best for users. Allow them to express themselves. It is important to allow service users to take the reins on how their interaction with your agency goes, and you must do this in a way that doesn't further oppress them.
Macro level action. Anti-oppressive practice on a macro level in agencies is a bit more of a tedious process. It requires more time, energy, and thought. This is because there are many levels of management within agencies. Even managers of companies may not hold the power necessary to make the changes we want. Working towards making changes at an institutional level requires many steps. It is important to have supports within the agency and outside the agency. External supports such as political officials and societies, as political officials and societies are the people that hold the framework for policy making. But before we advocate for policy, procedure, and budget changes, we must identify the oppression at hand. Macro level action calls for us to identify the oppression in the agency, identifying the troubles rooted in the oppression as patterns of pushing down the marginalized groups. As in, we must understand macro oppression in the workplace, critically think about the macro oppressive acts that are unconsciously and consciously implemented into the agency. The most important takeaway from this is that we must be able to stand alongside service users in their advocacy. Being an ally is helping to contribute to the larger cause. Anti-oppression is created in the moment. There is no formula. Every case, situation, and moment is different, in life and within agencies. There is no formula to solving oppression. It requires a lot of critical thinking, as there is no definitive, generalized answer that works to address every ism and forms of oppression within agencies. It is then where we are called to sit with the discomfort of hard questions that have no easy answers. Then we are able to critically look at the case and develop a plan that best suits the case at hand. This is a skill we must begin to develop as a society.
So, in order to give agencies an idea to manage their process in integrating and developing AOP into the workplace, we have created a general informative toolkit that can kickstart and prepare your organization to move towards an AOP vision. So you're probably wondering, why should your agency integrate AOP into practice? Oppression is embedded within systems/institutions we create and work with. And for real change to occur, we must restructure those very same forces. Change then begins with transforming and challenging our perceptions, assumptions, and our own privileges by critically analyzing what we know and recognize as dominant oppressive forces. AOP works to understand how communities or groups experience a pattern of pressing down by dominant privileged groups that prevent individuals from reaching their full potential. Our privilege as social workers, in this case, left unchecked, can be a barrier and an obstacle to the grounding practice we do with our clients. Nonprofit organizations such as yours work with disenfranchised and marginalized communities, which are groups that commonly face oppression. And thus, integrating AOP within the agency must be at the forefront of your work to maintain relationships and building rapport between the client and worker. So, what does integrating and developing AOP look like? So, first, let's take a look at AOP commitments. So, understand the ways groups or communities experience oppression and how they may intersect. This approach recognizes that individual contexts are different and that people's lived realities are complex. It is integrated because it asks us to combine information and values from a range of people and sources in order to get a fuller, more inclusive result in AOP workplace. Examine our own experiences with oppression and privilege. This insists that the dominant groups recognize the power of its own social locations and how the power results in societal privilege and benefit to the exclusion of marginalized people we work with. The third, acknowledge that integrating and developing AOP is an ongoing process. The purpose is to enact a guideline for action while also recognizing that change takes time and that there is no easy or simple way to apply AOP into practice, but that we attempt to integrate and continue to develop an approach that fits your agency. So what will change what will challenge potential barriers in the integration of AOP? So having supervisors and managers who endorse AOP, those in power, i.e. supervisors, questioning their own decisions, integrating realistic and clear standards of practice. Barnoff and Coleman, 2007, presented these 3 strategies that can be carried in an agency carrying AOP or wanting to apply it. It helps to assist employers, social workers, and service users a clear way to navigate through an AOP system, educate and engage authentically with one another, and empower our clients we work with. So, preparing your organization to challenge oppression. So, developing and revising policies can be a huge administrative task. As a result, policies tend to stay the same for years. This is a problem. Policies set out how the organization works and must be revised regularly as information changes and our knowledge on AOP grows. The hope is that this 4-step process provides your agency with an idea in integrating anti-oppression in your policy process. So let's start. Set up a committee. Supervisors and managers should enlist and fully fund a task force that includes employees from a diverse group. It should be large enough to maintain representation, but small enough to enforce the process. Members have access to confidential material and must agree to a signed outline. Set a schedule for revising or reviewing policies. Create a schedule that re-examines policies that are outdated, develop an agenda for meetings, try to create a schedule that reflects the size of your organization. Break the schedule up between what needs to happen during the review and what policies can be considered for the next. Review the organization's policies. Develop a questionnaire to facilitate deep discussion. Example, is this policy accessible? Make and assess recommendations. Ask non-committee members, perhaps, for yearly feedback, anonymous surveys. Summarize how each policy can be improved, i.e. creating a flip chart. Choose a non-biased facilitator for the discussion that's already in the task force. Write a report for the next AOP policy review. So put it on the table. We provided a few AOP perspectives that can create discussion while also unlearning and learning our experiences with privilege and oppression. Part of anti-oppressive social work can be understood as breaking down our feelings of uncertainty and uncomfortableness with change and unlearning the dominant oppressive roles and behaviors we play in the work we do. So on your left-hand side, we talk about Peggy McIntosh, who described that we can best understand our unearned advantages by inviting ourselves to ask us to unpack our privileges within our knapsack so it does not remain invisible. And that one of the examples that I have down below, race, ethnicity, gender, and so forth. So Intersectionality, a fun guide, helps us understand the impact of intersectionality and helps explain the idea that experiences with oppression are intertwined and affect all aspects of society, and thus must be solved not alone but together. And an AOP can attempt to help solve issues with intersecting experiences with oppression, especially with our clients. Finally, the topography of domination provides us as an important food for thought. Work starts with reflecting on our own privileges before we work with communities that are different from our own identities. This is to ensure that we do not impose our socially dominant values on our clients. So this is the end of our presentation. We hope that you consider making AOP a central part of your practice and that we have provided you an idea in how this can be done. Thank you for listening.